Imagine a world where your childhood ended before it truly began. A world where your destiny was decided not by your dreams, but by a legal agreement made when you were barely a child. In 900, for countless young girls, this was not a distant nightmare, but a stark reality. What truly happened to these girls? What were the devastating, life-altering consequences of such an early forced union? Number 8. The crushing burden of devastating health, complications, and early mortality. In the year 900, the world was a vastly different place, particularly for the health of young girls forced into marriage. Medical understanding was rudimentary, hygiene was poor, and the concept of reproductive health as we know it today was non-existent. When a girl, often no older than 7 or 8, sometimes even younger, was married, her tender body was instantly subjected to a myriad of risks that could easily lead to chronic illness, lifelong disability, or even premature death. It was a silent epidemic unfolding in countless homes across continents, yet largely unacknowledged by those in power or recorded in detail by the few who could write. One of the most immediate and horrifying consequences was the danger posed by early pregnancy and childbirth. A girl's body in 900, and even if she had begun to menstruate, was far from mature enough to safely carry a pregnancy to term, let alone endure the arduous process of childbirth. Her pelvis was not fully developed, her bones still growing, her internal organs still fragile. Forcing her into sexual relations, which was an expected part of marriage, meant that pregnancy could occur almost immediately after puberty began, or even be delayed only by her lack of physical readiness. When pregnancy did occur, the risks were astronomical. Historical records, though scarce and often not specifically detailing child brides, indicate alarmingly high rates of maternal mortality across pre-modern societies. For an adult woman, childbirth was perilous. For a child, it was often a death sentence. Consider a young girl named Anya, perhaps from a village in what is now modern-day France, married off at the age of 10 to a man twice her age. Her body was just beginning to show the first signs of womanhood. Yet, within a year, she was pregnant. Her small frame struggled under the weight of the growing life within her. Chronic fatigue, severe anemia, and constant pain would have been her daily companions. The meager diet available to her, often lacking in essential nutrients, would have exacerbated her already precarious health. When her time came to deliver, there would have been no trained medical professional, no midwife with specialized knowledge beyond what was passed down through generations, and certainly no sterile environment. She would have labored for days, her underdeveloped pelvis unable to accommodate the passage of a full-term infant. The outcome was often tragic: a stillborn child, or a child born with severe birth injuries, and the young mother herself suffering from obstructed labor, leading to devastating complications like obstetric fistula. This terrible injury, a hole between the birth canal and the bladder or rectum, would have left her incontinent, a social outcast and a pariah, even in her own home, leading to a life of misery and shame. And often simply, she would die from hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion, her life snuffed out before it had truly blossomed, all for a marriage she never chose. Beyond the immediate dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, these young girls were also highly vulnerable to infections. In an era without widespread understanding of germ theory, sexually transmitted infections, though not recognized as such, would have silently ravaged their bodies. These infections, often untreated, could lead to chronic pelvic pain, infertility, and an increased susceptibility to other diseases. A young girl, with her nascent immune system still developing, was less resilient to these diseases than an adult. Furthermore, the constant stress and trauma associated with early marriage and forced sexual activity would have weakened her overall physical health, making her more prone to common illnesses like dysentery, tuberculosis, or even the seasonal flu, which in 900 AD could be fatal. Scholars researching medieval health practices often describe how children, due to their developing bodies and weaker defenses, succumb to illnesses that adults might survive. A child bride already burdened was even more susceptible. The physical trauma was not limited to childbirth. Repeated pregnancies in quick succession, a common expectation for young wives in many cultures of the period, would have completely depleted a girl's body. Her nutritional reserves would have been constantly drained, leaving her perpetually weak and malnourished. Her bones, which should have been strengthening, would have remained brittle, prone to fractures. Her teeth would have decayed. Her vision might have deteriorated, and her general vitality would have been extinguished long before her natural time. Historical demographic studies, piecing together information from gravestone inscriptions and parish records where they exist for later medieval periods, suggest a consistent pattern of higher mortality rates for young women during their prime childbearing years, a trend intensified for those who began childbearing at an extremely young age. This grim reality meant that child marriage was, in essence, a practice that significantly shortened the lifespan of the girls subjected to it, trapping them in a cycle of physical suffering that began almost immediately upon their wedding day. The consequences were not merely discomfort or inconvenience, they were often literally a matter of life and death, shaping a future defined by pain, illness, and the ever-present shadow of an early grave. Number 7. The unforgivable theft of childhood and play. Imagine being 8 years old. Your world is probably filled with games, with laughter, with the boundless energy of discovery. You might be learning to read, or perhaps chasing butterflies in a field, or building imaginary castles in your backyard. Your biggest concern might be what game to play next. Now imagine that at that tender age, all of that is suddenly, irrevocably ripped away. This was the crushing reality for countless girls in 900 TAT who were forced into child marriage. Their childhood, a period of vital development, exploration, and joyous innocence, was simply stolen from them, replaced by the crushing responsibilities of adulthood. This wasn't merely a loss of fun and games, it was a profound deprivation of the very essence of what it means to be a child. Childhood, even in pre-modern societies, was a recognized stage of life, though its length and nature varied. Children learned, played, and slowly absorbed the skills and knowledge needed for adulthood. For a child bride, this gradual transition was brutally truncated. One day, she was playing with dolls made of straw, perhaps mimicking her mother's chores in a light-hearted way. The next, she was a wife, expected to perform those chores in earnest, to manage a household, and to submit to a husband who was often many years her senior. The simple act of play, crucial for cognitive, emotional, and social development, vanished from her life. She no longer had time to run, to jump, to engage in the imaginative pursuits that foster creativity and problem-solving. Her days became a relentless cycle of domestic duties, fetching water from the well, grinding grain, tending to fires, cleaning and cooking. These were not playful imitations, they were real, demanding, and often physically strenuous tasks that would exhaust her small body and consume her every waking moment. Consider Elara, a girl from a Slavic village married at 7. Her memories of childhood would have been brief flashes, perhaps a cherished wooden animal toy, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the laughter of her friends as they gathered berries in the forest. Suddenly, her home was no longer her parents' familiar dwelling, but the house of her husband's family, a place filled with strangers and rigid expectations. She was no longer free to explore the woods, to share secrets with her peers, or to simply daydream. Instead, her hands, still small and uncalloused, were tasked with the harsh realities of medieval domestic life. She was expected to spin wool, to mend clothes, to prepare meals over an open hearth, all while navigating the complex dynamics of a new family structure where she held the lowest status as a new young wife. The weight of these responsibilities would have been immense, robbing her of the carefree spirit that defines youth. Scholars examining childhood in the Middle Ages often highlight the importance of communal play and informal learning for children's development. For child brides, this essential communal experience was replaced by solitary labor or supervised tasks, further isolating them from their natural peer group. The psychological impact of this stolen childhood was immense. Children learn through play, through interaction, through observation and imitation in a safe environment. When this environment is replaced by the demanding expectations of marriage, a child's emotional development is stunted. They are forced to mature prematurely, skipping crucial stages of self-discovery and emotional regulation. This often led to an inability to express themselves, to understand their own feelings, or to form healthy attachments later in life. There was no time for introspection, no space for the slow growth of a personal identity separate from her role as wife. The world became a place of duty, not wonder. This lack of emotional and psychological nurturing often resulted in a pervasive sense of emptiness, a profound sadness that would color her entire existence. Furthermore, the loss of childhood meant the loss of a protective barrier. Childhood provides a space for vulnerability, for being cared for without the expectation of reciprocity. For child brides, this protective layer was instantly removed. They were no longer children to be nurtured, but wives to be exploited. Their small bodies and minds exposed to the harsh realities of adult life without the tools or resilience to cope. This premature exposure to adult relationships, particularly sexual ones, was profoundly traumatic and stripped away any remaining vestiges of innocence. The simple, joyful pursuits that mark a healthy childhood, storytelling, listening to fables, learning folk songs, participating in village festivals as a carefree spectator, were replaced by a grim determination to fulfill her new duties, to avoid punishment, and to simply survive. The laughter of children, a sound that echoes through all ages, would have been a distant, unreachable memory for many of these girls, replaced by the silence of forced submission or the quiet hum of endless labor. The theft of childhood was not merely unfortunate. It was an act of profound cruelty, leaving indelible scars on the mind and spirit, shaping a truncated existence devoid of the natural blossoming that every human being deserves. Number 6. The unyielding grip of educational deprivation and stifled potential. Imagine a mind hungry for knowledge, eager to learn, brimming with untapped potential. Now imagine that mind being deliberately starved, its curiosity extinguished, its capacity for growth severely limited from the moment it was forced into an early marriage. In 900, add for a girl, marriage at a young age was not just the end of play. It was, for all intents and purposes, the end of any meaningful opportunity for education or intellectual development, effectively stifling any potential she might have possessed beyond the confines of domesticity. In the medieval world, formal education was a rarity, largely reserved for boys, particularly those destined for the clergy, nobility, or specific trades. For girls, whatever limited learning was available typically centered on household management, rudimentary religious instruction, and perhaps basic literacy for aristocratic daughters. However, for the vast majority of girls, especially those in rural or common households, their education was informal, learned at their mother's side. Spinning, weaving, cooking, child-rearing, and basic agricultural. This was already a narrow path, but for a child bride, even this limited scope was often truncated or perverted. Her learning was no longer about nurturing skills for her future independent life, but about immediately serving her husband and his family. There was no time for anything else. Consider a young girl named Lyra, from a merchant family in a bustling town in what is now Germany. Her family, being relatively prosperous, might have allowed her to learn basic arithmetic, perhaps even to recognize letters and numbers if they aspired to elevate their daughter's status. But at 9 years old, she was married off to a much older, less educated tradesman from a distant village. Her new life involved waking before dawn to knead dough, to mend clothes for her husband and his apprentices, to manage the small household, and to fetch water and fuel. Intricate calculations involved in trade, the stories from illuminated manuscripts, the discussions of local politics that she might have overheard in her father's shop, all faded from her reach. Her day was filled with manual labor, her mind consumed by the practicalities of survival and servitude. There was no leisure for learning, no encouragement for intellectual pursuit, and certainly no access to the meager educational resources available. The intellectual curiosity that might have once sparked within her, the desire to understand the world beyond her immediate surroundings, was systematically crushed by the sheer weight of her daily responsibilities. Historical narratives from the period consistently show that women's roles were primarily domestic, and child marriage intensified this focus, removing any chance for a broader intellectual horizon. The absence of education meant a profound limitation on her understanding of the world. She would remain ignorant of basic health practices, of the wider political landscape, of different cultures, and even of her own legal rights, however minimal they might have been. This intellectual stunting left her vulnerable, unable to advocate for herself or make informed decisions. Her opinions, if she dared to voice them, would be dismissed as uneducated or childish. Her potential to contribute to society beyond her domestic role was entirely squandered. Perhaps she possessed a keen eye for patterns, a talent for storytelling, a knack for healing with herbs, or an innate leadership quality. These nascent abilities, which could have been honed and developed through education and experience, were simply left to wither. She was trapped in a cycle of mundane tasks, her mind once a fertile ground for growth becoming barren. Moreover, this deprivation was intergenerational. An uneducated mother, herself a child bride, would have fewer tools and less knowledge to impart to her own children. She could not teach them to read, even if she had learned herself, because her own life was too demanding. She could not provide intellectual stimulation or guide their curiosities. This created a perpetuating cycle where ignorance was passed down, locking families and communities into a limited worldview and hindering progress. The lack of intellectual engagement also contributed to a decline in mental agility and critical thinking over time. A mind that is not challenged or exposed to new ideas stagnates. For these girls, their intellectual journey often ended the day they became a wife, their curiosity replaced by compliance, their potential replaced by duty, leaving them with an unyielding grip of educational deprivation and a lifetime of stifled, unfulfilled potential. It was a tragedy not just for the individual girl, but for the collective human spirit, as countless brilliant minds were muted before they ever had the chance to truly shine. Number 5. The invisible wounds of crippling psychological trauma and mental health decline. The physical wounds of child marriage in 900 AD were often stark and undeniable, but the deepest, most pervasive damage was frequently hidden from plain sight. The crippling psychological trauma and the devastating decline in mental health that afflicted these young girls. They were forced into a situation entirely beyond their comprehension or control, stripping them of their autonomy, their safety, and their very sense of self, leading to an array of invisible wounds that could haunt them for a lifetime. Imagine a girl, no more than 9 or 10 years old, named Serafina, from a Norman village. She is suddenly taken from her family, her familiar surroundings, and thrust into the home of a much older man who is now her husband. This abrupt, non-consensual transition would trigger profound fear, anxiety, and a sense of abandonment. Her understanding of relationships would be based on parental love and sibling companionship, not the expectations of a marital bond, particularly one that often involved sexual coercion and an imbalance of power. This instant shift from being a protected child to a wife with duties and demands would be a source of immense stress, a feeling of being constantly overwhelmed and out of control. Many historical sources from later periods and anecdotal accounts from medieval times suggest that young girls in such situations often suffered from chronic anxiety, manifesting as constant worry, difficult sleeping, and a pervasive sense of dread was particularly traumatizing. Forcing a child into sexual activity, often before she even understood what it entailed, constituted severe sexual abuse. This trauma could lead to immediate psychological shock, followed by a lifetime of emotional pain. She might experience extreme fear of intimacy, flashbacks, dissociation, and a profound sense of shame or disgust towards her own body. This constant psychological burden would likely manifest as depression, a deep and pervasive sadness, a loss of interest in activities, and an inability to find joy. Her spirit, once bright and curious, would dim, replaced by a dull ache of despair. The very concept of consent, so vital for psychological well-being, was utterly absent. This absence, coupled with the power imbalance inherent in child marriage, created a fertile ground for profound psychological distress. Furthermore, the isolation that often accompanied child marriage deepened these mental wounds. Separated from her childhood friends and the nurturing environment of her birth family, the young bride found herself in a new household where she was an outsider, often viewed with suspicion or as mere property. She had no one to confide in, no one who understood her plight, and no safe space to process her feelings. This loneliness could exacerbate feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. She might internalize the idea that she was unloved or unwanted, leading to low self-esteem and a belief that her existence was only valid in service to others. This constant emotional burden, coupled with the physical hardships and lack of control over her own life, created a perfect storm for the development of chronic mental health conditions. While specific diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder or clinical depression were not recognized in 900-odd, the symptoms and suffering would have been very real, manifesting as withdrawal, emotional numbness, persistent sadness, and an inability to function normally. The lack of agency was another major contributor to psychological distress. Child bride had no say in her marriage, no voice in her daily life, and no control over her future. Her decisions were made for her. Her body was not her own, and her existence was defined by the expectations of others. This complete lack of autonomy fostered a pervasive sense of helplessness and powerlessness. This feeling, over time, can lead to learned helplessness, where an individual gives up trying to change their circumstances because they believe no effort will make a difference. This extinguishes hope and initiative, trapping them in a cycle of passive suffering. Historical accounts, though not clinical, often describe women of this period, particularly those in subservient roles, as quiet, withdrawn, and resigned, symptoms that align with chronic depression and anxiety. For many child brides, this meant a lifetime of quiet desperation, their inner worlds marked by trauma, fear, and a profound mental health decline, the invisible wounds of a life that was never truly their own. Number 4. The entangling web of entrapment in cycles of poverty and economic helplessness. In the year 900 AD, where agrarian societies were the norm, and survival often depended on familial structures, child marriage did not just affect a girl's personal life. It was a powerful force that often trapped her, and potentially her future generations, within an entangling web of poverty and profound economic helplessness. Far from providing stability, it frequently ensured a perpetual state of dependence, leaving these young brides with virtually no means of supporting themselves or their children independently. Imagine a girl named Astrid, from a peasant family in Anglo-Saxon England, married at the age of 12. Her family, perhaps struggling with a poor harvest or a debt, saw her marriage as a way to secure a small dowry or to lessen the burden of another mouth to feed. However, by marrying her off young, they inadvertently denied her any opportunity to acquire skills that could lead to even a modest degree of economic independence. In this era, skill acquisition was largely informal and often gender segregated. While boys might apprentice as blacksmiths, carpenters, or farmers' girls were primarily taught domestic tasks. An older unmarried woman might find work as a laundress, a spinner for hire, or even a wet nurse, earning a small income. Child bride, however, was immediately immersed in her husband's household. Her labor, though essential, was unpaid and unrecognized as distinct economic contribution outside of the family unit. She became a dependent, producing goods and services for her husband's family, without receiving any direct monetary compensation or control over resources. Furthermore, child marriage severely limited a girl's ability to inherit property or assert any rights to resources. While inheritance laws varied widely across different regions in 900, women generally had very limited property rights compared to men. A girl married young would quickly become part of her husband's household, losing her claim to her birth family's resources and gaining very little, if any, independent economic standing within her new family. Her dowry, if one existed, often went directly to her husband's family, who controlled its use. She had no personal purse, no independent means, and no ability to accumulate wealth or assets. This economic helplessness was compounded by her lack of education and vocational training. Without literacy or specialized skills, she was unable to pursue any trade that might offer a degree of autonomy. Her options were limited to the domestic sphere, where her labor, while vital, was not considered wage earning. Consider the ripple effect of this economic entrapment. If Astrid's husband died prematurely, as was common in 900 due to disease, famine, or conflict, she would be left a young widow, often with several young children. With no skills beyond basic household chores, no property in her name, and no independent income, she would be utterly destitute. Her only recourse might be to return to her birth family if they would take her, or to become a servant, or in the worst cases to resort to begging. This scenario, tragically common, solidified her position in a cycle of poverty. Her daughters, observing their mother's desperate circumstances, might also be married off young as a perceived solution to their own economic insecurity, thus perpetuating the cycle. Children themselves born to a young, likely malnourished mother would often suffer from poor health, further limiting their own future economic prospects. Historical demographic studies, where they can be inferred from records of the period, reveal that early marriage often correlated with larger family sizes and higher rates of child mortality, placing immense strain on already meager resources, further solidifying the family's precarious economic status. The institution of child marriage, therefore, was not just a social or cultural practice. It was an economic one that consistently disempowered young girls, ensuring their lifelong dependence. It prevented them from contributing to the wider economy in any meaningful, recognized way, and it made them incredibly vulnerable to destitution and hardship. Their future was not their own to shape. It was dictated by their lack of economic agency, leaving them caught in a persistent, suffocating web of poverty, a legacy passed down through generations. The promise of security through marriage often delivered instead a cruel reality of lifelong economic helplessness, making it a tragic cornerstone of systemic disadvantage. Number 3. The terrifying shadow of pervasive risk of domestic violence and abuse. For a girl in 900 forced into child marriage, her new home often became a place not of refuge or affection, but of fear. The terrifying shadow of pervasive domestic violence and abuse loomed large, a cruel and constant threat that permeated her daily existence. In a society where women had few rights and child protection was non-existent, these young brides were exceptionally vulnerable to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, often with no recourse, or hope of escape. Imagine a girl like Inga, a child of perhaps 10 years, from a remote settlement in what is now Scandinavia, given in marriage to a man considerably older, perhaps already widowed, seeking a young, fertile wife. Her new husband would have viewed her not as a partner or even a child, but as property. This fundamental perception, widespread in many cultures of 900 AD, stripped her of her humanity and made her particularly susceptible to abuse. Inga would have been expected to be immediately obedient, to perform demanding household chores, and to satisfy her husband's desires without question. Her youth and lack of understanding would not have excused her from these expectations. In fact, they often made her more susceptible to punishment for perceived failings. Physical abuse was a horrifying reality. A husband, frustrated by a young wife's inability to perform chores perfectly, or angered by her childish behavior, could easily resort to violence. There were no laws to protect her, no authorities she could appeal to. Beatings, often severe, would have been common, a means of control and discipline. Historical accounts, though not specific to child brides, frequently mention the social acceptance of a man's right to physically discipline his wife. For a small, underdeveloped child, such beatings could lead to severe injuries, broken bones, internal damage, or even death. Her young body, already fragile, was further brutalized by the very person who was supposed to be her protector. Constant threat of physical violence would have instilled a profound sense of terror, forcing her into a state of hypervigilance and fear, shaping her every action and interaction. Beyond the physical, emotional abuse would have been equally devastating. Constant verbal degradation, threats, isolation, and psychological manipulation would erode her self-worth and spirit. She might be told she was worthless, stupid, or ugly, constantly reminded of her lower status and lack of value outside of her marital role. Her desires, her thoughts, her very being would be dismissed and suppressed. This relentless emotional assault would chip away at her mental resilience, fostering deep-seated insecurities and a crippling sense of helplessness. The lack of social support and the inability to communicate her distress to anyone sympathetic would have amplified the impact of this abuse, trapping her in a silent, suffocating cycle of despair. Scholars studying the dynamics of medieval households often highlight the absolute authority of the male head of the household, which offered little protection for vulnerable members, especially young wives. The sexual abuse inherent in child marriage was perhaps the most traumatic. Forcing a child who is physically and emotionally unready into sexual relations is a profound violation. This coercion was not seen as abuse within the societal norms of 900 AD, but it was abuse nonetheless. The physical pain, the fear, and the profound sense of violation would have left deep, lasting psychological scars, contributing to a lifetime of trauma, as previously discussed. This was a private terror, something she could not speak of, something she was simply expected to endure. Her body was not her own. It was a tool for procreation and her husband's pleasure. Furthermore, the isolation of a child bride often meant there were no witnesses to her suffering, no one to intervene. Her new family might condone the abuse, viewing it as necessary discipline, or simply turn a blind eye. Her own birth family, having given her away, might not be able or willing to interfere, especially if it meant breaking a marriage contract or challenging a powerful family. This lack of intervention, combined with the absence of legal protections, meant that a child bride lived under a constant, terrifying shadow. Her life defined by the pervasive risk of violence and abuse, with no escape in sight. Her story, though untold in formal histories, was one of silent suffering, a testament to the brutal realities of a world that offered little mercy to its most vulnerable members. Number 2, the heartbreaking void of deep social isolation and severed community ties. Imagine waking up one day to find yourself completely alone, cut off from everything and everyone you once knew and loved. This was the heartbreaking reality for countless girls in 900 AD who were subjected to child marriage. Practice often led to profound social isolation and the severing of essential community ties, leaving these young brides in a desolate void, far from the comfort of family, friends, and the familiar rhythm of their home village. For many child brides, marriage meant being moved from their birth family's home to that of their husband, often in a different village or even a distant region. This geographical relocation was a brutal severance. A girl named Anya, perhaps from a farming community in what is now Hungary, would have grown up surrounded by her siblings, cousins, and childhood friends. She would have known every path, every tree, every face in her village. Her life was interwoven with the social tapestry of her community. Shared chores, village festivals, the gossip at the well, the comforting presence of familiar faces. When she was married off at the age of 8, she was suddenly uprooted and transplanted into an entirely new, often alien environment. She lost her immediate family support system, the comforting presence of her mother, the protection of her father, the companionship of her siblings. These foundational relationships, crucial for a child's emotional security and development, were abruptly broken. In her new home, she was an outsider. Her husband's family, often viewing her as little more than a new hand for labor or a vessel for future children, might be unwelcoming or even hostile. The other women in the household, her mother-in-law, sisters-in-law, could be demanding, critical, or even cruel, seeing her as competition or an intruder. There were no friends from her past to confide in, no shared memories or inside jokes. She had to navigate new customs, new expectations, and new hierarchies without the support of her peers or the guidance of her own family. Her young age further exacerbated this isolation. She was too young to genuinely connect with the adult women of the household and too burdened with adult responsibilities to play with other children, if there were any of a similar age. This created a profound social void, a deep sense of loneliness and alienation. Historians studying medieval social structures frequently highlight the importance of kinship networks and village communities for survival and well-being. For a child bride, these vital networks were often irrevocably shattered. The absence of a peer group was particularly detrimental. Children learn social skills, empathy, and how to navigate relationships through interactions with others their own age. Child bride, isolated from her peers, was deprived of this crucial social learning. She might not develop the social confidence or emotional intelligence necessary for healthy relationships, leading to a perpetual sense of awkwardness or withdrawal. Her only significant interactions were with adults, often those who held power over her, further reinforcing her subservient role and stifling her ability to express herself freely. The laughter and easy camaraderie of childhood, a fundamental human need, were replaced by silence and the weight of her new, isolated existence. Even if her husband's family was not overtly cruel, the sheer emotional and geographical distance from her origins created a psychological chasm. She might long for her mother's touch, for the familiar smells of her childhood home, for the sound of her father's voice. These unresolved feelings of longing and loss could contribute to chronic sadness and a pervasive sense of displacement. She might spend her life feeling like she belonged nowhere, a stranger in her own home. The occasional visit back to her birth village, if permitted, might offer only fleeting comfort, serving as a painful reminder of what she had lost before she was forced back to her new, isolated life. The heartbreaking void of deep social isolation and severed community ties was not merely a consequence. It was a fundamental deprivation that robbed child brides of emotional nourishment, leaving them profoundly alone in a world that demanded everything from them, but offered little in return. It was a silent, agonizing suffering, echoing through the empty spaces of their isolated lives. Number 1. The utter erasure of identity and complete loss of autonomy. Perhaps the most insidious and utterly tragic consequence of child marriage for girls in 900 odd was the complete erasure of their burgeoning identity and the profound absolute loss of any semblance of autonomy. From the moment the marriage contract was sealed, these young girls ceased to be individuals with their own thoughts, dreams, and potential. They became effectively property, their very existence defined by their role as wife and future mother. With no personal agency or choice, this was a death of the self, long before the body ever succumbed. Imagine a young girl, perhaps named Isolde, living in a small Saxon settlement, with a nascent personality just beginning to form. She might have had a favorite game, a particular talent for drawing in the dirt with a stick, or a quiet dream of one day helping her mother tend the herbs. Her identity was a delicate, developing thing, shaped by her parents' love, her interactions with her siblings, and her place in her community. Then, at the age of 7 or 8, she was married off. Suddenly, her name might even change, subsumed by her husband's family. Her old identity, her very being, was abruptly extinguished, replaced by a new, imposed one. Wife. She was no longer Isolde, the spirited girl who loved herbs. She was now the property of her husband, a domestic asset, her purpose solely to serve his needs and to bear his children. This wasn't merely a shift in roles, it was an obliteration of who she was becoming. The loss of autonomy was absolute. From the moment of marriage, her body was no longer her own. She had no say in her daily activities, her future, or even her most intimate experiences. Her husband, as the head of the household, exercised complete control over her. She could not refuse sexual advances. She could not choose where she lived. She could not decide what work she would do, and she certainly could not leave the marriage. Her mobility was restricted. Her interactions outside the home were limited and supervised. Every aspect of her life was dictated by her husband and his family. This fundamental lack of control over her own existence fostered a pervasive sense of powerlessness and dehumanization. She was a chattel, a possession utterly devoid of the right to self-determination. Historical legal codes and social norms from various regions in 900 consistently illustrate women's subordinate status, particularly that of married women, who were legally subsumed under their husband's authority. For child brides, this legal and social reality was magnified by their extreme youth and vulnerability. This forced submission and lack of agency crippled any internal development of self-worth or personal desires. Why dream if your dreams can never be realized? Why form opinions if your voice will never be heard? Over time, many child brides would internalize this lack of autonomy, ceasing to even consider their own needs or desires. Their thoughts and actions would become entirely oriented towards fulfilling the expectations of others, suppressing any original thought or independent impulse. This was not a conscious decision, but a slow, insidious process of adaptation and survival, where the self became a hollow vessel stripped of its essence. The joy of independent thought, the dignity of personal choice, these were luxuries entirely denied to them. The ultimate tragedy was the loss of potential that came with this erasure of identity. Each girl was born with unique talents, passions, and a capacity for growth. Perhaps one girl had a brilliant mind, another a gift for art, a third a natural leadership quality. Child marriage, with its demands for immediate domestic labor and absolute submission, ensured that these innate potentials were never nurtured, never discovered, and never allowed to flourish. Her life was reduced to a predetermined script written by others, for the benefit of others. She never truly got to know herself, to understand her own strength, or to define her own purpose. Her existence became a functional one, devoid of personal meaning or self-actualization. This utter erasure of identity and complete loss of autonomy left an enduring scar, creating a tragic narrative of lives lived without personal freedom without self-expression, and without the fundamental human right to simply be oneself. Their silence echoes through history, a testament to the profound cost of childhood, stolen, and personhood denied.